on if you want.
And I've just started the recording. Well, look, I'll leave myself on. Okay, Jenny, so actually, I was thinking of this. I went for a run this morning and I was thinking of the talk. And the question I was just going to ask you, where were you when the news of Whitlam's dismissal came through?
Well, like many people, I can actually remember that quite clearly. I was a student then and studying at Monash University, and a very good friend of mine stopped me literally in my tracks. I think I was coming back from a class or possibly an exam, and said, Whitlam's been sacked. And I just recall a sense of complete disbelief. I didn't understand how that could have happened. I was shocked, distressed, because my family was very much a Labor family in terms of their support. My father who was a doctor, had in fact just moved to Canberra only that year to work in the health department for the government. And, I think that affected me far more than I realised, the sense within the family of great distress. I remember my father telling me when Whitlam was elected that since he was 21 years old, every election, every party he had supported had been defeated. And of course, he was in his 40s then, and this seemed like an absolute age. And I was, that stuck with me, that how distressed he was, in particular, having moved, family and life up there in Canberra by what happened. So I didn't see it in those terms at the time. I didn't go on to study politics or history for many years after that. I studied sciences. But it came back to me later. It always stayed with me. And I guess, the product of that came later.
Well, I was actually buying my first car. I was at a car dealership at Fishwick in Canberra. I was with my mother, she used to work in the parliamentary library at night. I had a much younger sister, so she couldn't work during the day. And so she was very interested in politics. And one of the dealers came out and sort of said, you wouldn't believe. So I subsequently went ahead and bought the car. And then I mad person that I was, I went to one of the protests that Whitlam held in front of Parliament House, a couple of weeks later. And being, a new car driver, that was probably the last thing I should have done, because I can remember I nearly ran over a policeman leaving the car park after the talk. So, yeah, but it was, and I think perhaps if people want to share via the chat facility where they were, it was a big moment. It was a big moment. And yeah, so just coming back to your father, so he was a psychologist, is that correct?
He was a psychiatrist.
Sorry. Yeah.
And yes, he did a lot of work actually with concentration camp survivors in Melbourne, and he was a very caring and important work that he did. So, it was a very interesting background, I think, in terms of political interest. It was very strong. My mother was a lawyer, a barrister. She was actually the first barrister briefed in the Mabo case, and that's not widely known because it became overtaken with others who came in, of course, for the actual High Court case. But she'd been writing in the field of native title in common law for more than a decade, and she'd done both a Master's Preliminary and a Master of Law at Monash in native title law, and had one very important article in particular in the Federal Law Review that was cited in the High Court decision. So, it was always a family where politics and law and these intersections were part of the general discussion. And I recognise now just how important that was in my own work. I obviously fed a lot off that and enjoyed those conversations. But as I say, I didn't really come to make that a focus of my study, probably for more than a decade later.
And so your mother, just coming back to Mabo, so it was the native treaty history that led her to being selected for the barrister role, and so on?
Yes, well, the famous conference that some of your listeners and you may know about is the conference that was held in Townsville I think very early on, could have been the late 70s, early 80s. And Eddie Mabo spoke, and several members of the what became the 5 plaintiff team were there, and Henry Reynolds and my mother, and it was a very important conference in terms of establishing the groundwork for, or the grounds for, a High Court challenge. And in fact, my mother's paper was called "Is Might Right? An Argument for Taking a High Court Case on Native Title." And literally her paper set out the means through which to do this. I just actually gave a paper a couple of weeks ago. She was recognised at the Victorian Bar with a portrait, and I gave a brief talk about her role in that conference. And it is remarkable. It was extraordinary, talking about archives and, you know, how important archives are to history. I've got a box of my mother's papers, huge box, just with Mabo written on the side. And I had not opened that for about a decade since her death. She died 10 years ago. And I opened it in preparation for this talk. And to my astonishment, there were several very, very small cassette tapes, tiny little cassette tapes, very old. And they are literally cassette tapes of the talks at the Townsville Conference, out of which the Mabo case came.
Okay.
And it includes Eddie Mabo speaking, my mother speaking. So we were able to transfer that into a usable form, and I was able to listen to her talk, and it was quite, apart from being very emotional, it was very, very interesting, because she literally speaks to the Indigenous people in the audience and sets out what needs to be done very clearly. And Greg McIntyre, who was a young solicitor in Queensland at the time, spoke after or with her on that same panel. He was then briefed as the solicitor. My mother, Barbara, was briefed as the barrister, and those two became the kernel of the case as it then stepped forward. So the case literally began at that conference. And that was my mother's role for the next 5 years. She was working tirelessly on the Mabo case.
And then, okay, and Jenny, then coming back to yourself, so you went to Monash, so that must have been was it a relatively new campus at that stage?
No, Monash had been around, well, relatively, yes. I mean, everything was relatively new compared to Melbourne University, which had been the only university for so long. But it was certainly a hothouse of, political activity. It was still seen as, I guess, a radical campus because of the nature of the anti-war demonstrations that have been very, very strong at Monash in the years before I got there. And it was a lively place. You know, when I returned, you can probably hear the birds there. When I returned to teach there many years later as a lecturer, I was struck by how much quieter it was. You know, the campus experience has really changed, I think, for students now. It's much more an experience of not even going into lectures. It's zooming into lectures. I think that's a real pity. There was a liveliness and a social interaction that came with going to university that, unfortunately, I think is perhaps an indulgence that younger people now can't afford. Quite literally, they are working 2 or 3 or 4 jobs at the same time as studying. And I suppose people of my generation had the great benefit of Gough Whitlam's free tertiary education, and what a difference it made to people's lives and capacity to study. So I'll always be very grateful for that.
I actually go to the ANU. I umpire the inter-college football. They have 10 colleges, and they have Aussie rules. And I've got to say, there's too much social interaction, Jenny, and we need to have an ambulance at every game now, because it gets a bit carried away. But anyway, that's by the by. So you started off doing science. What made you switch across to history?
Well, I did science to mathematics, actually, believe it or not. Really, because at that point you did get streamed ridiculously early in your school years, and it's not the case now, and I think it's much healthier now that young people aren't expected to know what direction they might seek to go in. I wasn't particularly unhappy doing it, but it wasn't a great passion, and I finished that degree and realised that it really wasn't where I wanted to remain. And the only second degree I could look at that would recognise some of my mathematics subjects as, you know, and give you credit for them in effect, was to do economics, which likes to think it's mathematics, but actually it isn't. And so I took up economics and ended up doing economic history, which I absolutely loved. There was a brilliant lecturer at Monash at that time, and a marvellous, fascinating avenue opened up for me of history in a very interdisciplinary way. It's a type of historical understanding that brings in economics, necessarily brings in politics, and through that, that was my pathway, and I knew I wanted to remain there, and that I then did a PhD in that sort of general field at Sydney University. It was called Government and Public Administration, but it's basically a political science, but also an economic history element in that school at the time. So I found my place and always enjoyed that, and began writing really from the moment I picked up that degree and started publishing articles. And to combine the two things I really enjoyed. History, politics, well, three things: history, politics, and writing about them. So I was very lucky to find that way and find that path through economic history at Monash.
Yeah, no, I did economic history at the ANU, and I share your enthusiasm. It was a great course. And it's unusual to start writing so soon as an academic, Jenny. It strikes me that it is.
I think it was. I was encouraged to write, actually, when I was doing economic history in my final year by one of the lecturers. As I said, there were two terrific lecturers there.
Who were they, Jenny? Who were they, Jenny?
Oh, I thought you might ask me that. One was Dick Bryant, and I think the other one was Ian Ward. Ian Ward was the senior lecturer, and just a very engaging, passionate few people who were there. It was not a big part of the economics section, as you might imagine, but fascinating material that was looked at. Very good lecturers, and they did encourage me to write. And so I did. I began to publish things. I published something as soon as I went to Sydney University with the late, great Ted Wheelwright, who was a political economist there and ran the political economy section. And he always had a competition which was great for students, where, you know, the best of the year would be published in one or other of, I can't remember the journal, but one of my essays ended up there. And so that was a great thrill as a young student. And from that point on, I always felt fairly comfortable seeking publication. So it was a lesson for me later as a lecturer, how to encourage students to do their best and to seek publication and confidence out of doing that. And, you know, I was lucky. I had great lecturers, great experience at both those universities. I stayed at Sydney University, then moved into a PhD and stayed there for about 4 years until that was completed, and also did some part-time research work there. So it was a very lively and a very rewarding time.
So Ted Wheelwright was pretty hard left, wasn't he?
Yes, it was actually, I think I was a bit oblivious to the internal politics that was clearly going on in the department at the time. I was just enjoying the lectures. I wasn't doing just political economy, so I think I was sort of not really quite so bound up in that. But yes, there was a big schism between the political economy school, which was seen as not just because it was seen as, you know, left politics, but it was more, I think, that it was a type of economics that was not popular at the time. This was a period where monetarist policy was very, very strong, and that had sway in most departments, including at Monash, when I'd done the undergraduate degree. So, but I was doing a PhD as I then moved into in more traditional government and public administration, which was really what the politics section was called there. It was a mix of public administration and straight politics, so political science. So that was my main focus, but I wanted to do the degree. I think I did Ted Wheelwright's course, technically not for degree. In other words, I didn't need to do it, but I did it because I was so interested in economic history, and it was a great grounding for the political science program in the PhD. So it was basically an additional workload for me, but I enjoyed it very much.
I think economic history is always possibly looked as a little bit soft because there's no mathematical formulas involved. Certainly,
yeah, I think it's always.
Yeah,
I think it's always had a sort of uneasy placement somewhere between economics and history or politics, and yet, you know, economic history is in many ways the backbone of both economics and political history. So it's a pity in my mind that it's not a more robust part of most of those degrees, but it no longer is.
Yeah, and I think probably for many of the people here, having lived through the 80s with the Hawke-Keating reforms, it was not just the economic reforms, it was the political nature of how they got consensus that made it such an interesting period. And I think most governments since have failed to follow the sort of template that they set out, that to bring people with them. But and so you've always sort of had that interest in obviously being on the left, and then a lot of interest in Whitlam, and you've written on Frank Hardy and other people. So you mentioned briefly that was before that sort of came out of the family upbringing.
I'm not sure how that developed. To me, I think the first thing that developed for me once I started writing was I was interested in the nature of democratic practice. My PhD thesis was on, of all things, Australia's counter-terrorism strategy. And this was in the late 80s, or in the 80s, when we didn't really have a counter-terrorism strategy. And what I was looking at was the development of that. It was gradually taking shape. We didn't yet even have any legislation that specifically named terrorism, whereas now, of course, we have an absolute plethora of that. But most comparable Western nations did. And I was interested and concerned by the way in which many of those legislative provisions were, in fact, very onerous, both in criminological terms, but also particularly in terms of political activity and the impact they may inadvertently have on elements of what you might see as political activity at the margins, depending on how robustly they might be applied. So I actually was arguing that it was a good thing that Australia didn't yet have legislation that used this very uncertain term of terrorism. And there were many in Australia at the time arguing that that was not the path to go down, and that it was a much better path to continue to use the existing criminal law to prosecute breaches of either bombings or other activities that would come within the existing law. That all changed with 9/11, and then we saw, you know, an absolute overturning of the way in which Australia had developed its counterterrorism strategy. So I actually published 2 books and many articles in that field, and that was my area of expertise, and in quite some, you know, some demand, particularly after 9/11, to keep writing in that field. I had been very much influenced by a book by someone called Bertrand Gross, The Friendly Face of Fascism, an American political scientist, and that had led me to look at ways in which democratic practice can endanger itself. And I think those core concerns are also the concerns I had about the dismissal in a very, very different way, but nevertheless looking at ways in which the functionality of democratic practice, literally through the Parliament, the Vice-Regal Office, and of course the dismissal and the expression of that, how that impacts on the nature of representative democracy. So while they seem like very disparate areas, I can actually see a consistent thread through all of that different work. And the first port of call for me was a biography of the former High Court judge and Attorney General in the Whitlam government, Lionel Murphy. And the reason I was interested in Murphy is because there's a famous, well, in the field of counterterrorism studies, it's a famous, or security studies, it's a famous judgment, the Church of Scientology case, Church of Scientology and ASIO versus ASIO against ASIO, which centered on the question of what is subversion, what constitutes subversive practice. Is the church, should the church be seen as in any way liable to security surveillance by ASIO? So it was a very important case. And Murphy's judgment was so different from that of the other High Court judges that I sort of momentarily thought I'd picked up the wrong photocopying when I photocopied all the judgments. I just was astonished by his easy language, the clear political implications of what the judgment was saying, his view of security services that was very, very clear and could also be seen in his work as an Attorney General. So I was fascinated by this person who himself later became subject to surveillance, subject to claims, and basically destroyed. Absolutely fascinating narrative. And I decided to write a biography of him. And as soon as I started writing in a biographical form, I knew that that for me was a really marvellous way to look at politics and history. And so I stuck with that through the Frank Hardy biography you mentioned, and then, of course, 2 volumes on Gough Whitlam.
Yes, because I was going to mention, Frank Hardy, it's football and religion, Power and Glory, Archbishop Mannix and the Collingwood Football Club, isn't it? And it's sort of the interaction of those two. But just a final question, I'll come back into that historical research and lead up to the palaces, but just one on counterterrorism. So what's your view on the situation as it is now with our Home Affairs Department and militarized police forces?
Well, I think, look, the concern I always had was that the legislative and administrative process around counterterrorism are necessarily very difficult to define. The definitions used at their innermost precision are full of uncertainties that, it's been argued that the term terrorism has a judgmental element in and of itself. When is something an act of terrorism and when is it a criminal offence under the existing criminal law? These all take judgments and are very difficult to define. But at the outer point, where a person can be charged with preparing to undertake an act of terrorism that may not have taken place, you can see that these have real difficulties in their application. And each iteration of the counterterrorism legislative measures has been broader than the one before it and has enabled the security services or the police or the warrants that can be issued by self-administering rather than having to go to a judge or even a minister, are points of potential problem. And I had argued that for many years. And so to see that actually coming a reality with some of these developments, I found actually quite difficult to respond to, because all around the world, I think it's been pointed to the excesses of some of these legislative measures. So I think we need a very tight rein from the security monitor and to ensure that they are adhered to as they ought to be. But once you start trying to define terrorism, it's no academics have yet agreed on what constitutes, what the core definition is. There's about 150 different definitions.
Okay, let's come back to historical research. So I know many of the people here saw the ABC program earlier in the year on the Palace Letters, and one of the things that really hit me was you going into the archives and getting boxes out with files and going through them. So how much is research writing actually doing that process, going in, getting old papers, getting old documents, And how much is it maybe synthesizing people have already written on the subject? And I'm interested in military history, for example, and there's a lot being written, and I just want, a lot of the books strike me that they've looked at past books. They haven't actually done original research, if I maybe put it that way.
Yeah.
I'm
I
really
mean,
that process.
I think a lot of that depends on the sort of field you're looking at. But particularly with the things I like to look at, which are, if you like, contested histories that I think there is more to be said, and perhaps a story that's yet to be told. But you're right, a big problem is when there's a received history, and the received history tends to take for granted certain things that may actually not be true. And there's no better example of that, not just the dismissal, but in much of the circumstances of the Whitlam government itself. I was constantly astonished when I was doing the biography of Whitlam to go back to original temporal, that is contemporaneous media coverage, and see how different much of it was from what was later described from that time. And, there's a wonderful quote from Whitlam himself, to go to the documents. I think I refer to that in the film. And going to the documents is extremely important when you're looking at a history that is polarizing and that has a contested element to it, because, spoils to the victor is a common term, but it actually, in this regard, has some weight. So perhaps unusually, in all of the things I've looked at, Murphy, Hardy and Whitlam, I went back to original sources, that is archival material and personal records, probably much more than many other historians may do. And I'm greatly helped by the fact that I actually enjoy doing that. I find that fascinating. Of course, if you spend months in the archives and don't find anything that isn't already out there, well, there's probably not much use going through them, but always there was material that was just completely unknown. And one very good example with Whitlam is the simple fact that his grandfather had been in Pentridge prison as a teenager, and no one knew that, not even Gough Whitlam. And this was his grandfather that he was named after, Henry Hugh Gough Whitlam. It was a great shock. It left him speechless for the first time in our many meetings. So that was remarkable, but it explained to me a great deal about the certain elements in the family.
Why was he in Pentridge? Because Pentridge is now a hotel, swimming pool, and
it certainly wasn't then, I can assure you. Well, he was 18 years old. His father, Whitlam's great-grandfather, had more or less deserted the family, and there was a family of 5 children. He was the eldest. They had very little money. He was working, I think, in a bakery, and he clearly could read and write, as all the family, it appears, could, which is important because his employer could not. And so Whitlam Senior, the grandfather, had responsibility for taking the money to the bank every week. His mother couldn't pay the rent. The family was about to be evicted. He took the money hoping to repay it the next week, and in the meantime was caught. So it's all there in the prisoner records in the Victorian Public Records Office. And I'm reading this really sad, poignant story with this young boy pleading with his mother to hide the money. The police are coming, and a letter that had been in his pocket to his father saying, "Please come home. We've got no money, we've got no food," etc. It was amazingly immediate, and I knew that I was going to have to tell Gough Whitlam. So he was charged. He had, of course, as Gough said to me, well, he didn't have the benefit of our legal aid system, which he didn't. And he was, even though his own employer went into the court and said, "I don't want to press charges, I'll take him back tomorrow if you release him," which is pretty amazing. He was sentenced to 4.5 years with hard labour.
Wow.
And sent to Pentridge. But I think the important thing for the family makeup was that when he came out, he married very soon after a devout Baptist woman, Gough's grandmother, from a very well-known Baptist family. How they met, I don't know. I couldn't ascertain that, largely because nobody knew that he'd been in Pentridge. But he, you know, that adoption of a very strict Baptist belief played right through the Whitlam family. Whitlam's own father tithed his income his whole life. So did his uncle, who lived with them for a time in Canberra. So there's a fascinating interplay of religion, a notion of public good and giving back, and a great, great belief in self-advancement through education, which you can see in every generation. And his own father, as Whitlam said to me, moved from one side of the law to the other in a single generation because his own father became Commonwealth Crown Solicitor. So it's a remarkable story of, I suppose, social mobility in Australia at that time of great sort of economic upheaval.
So Jenny, you start doing your research. I presume you have some sort of template or skeleton of what you think. So with the Palace letters, suddenly you discover stuff that you had no idea was there, that most people had no idea, and others wanted to be hidden, I suppose. What's that like? Suddenly, is it a eureka moment, or is it, oh my God, I've got to do so much more digging?
Well, it's a bit of both. I think Whitlam's grandfather was a bit of a eureka moment because it was a shock, but it also explained a lot. It explained some sort of things I'd been curious about, that there was a clear religiosity element there. And yet where did it come from? How did this change effect in the family? So that explained a lot, and it was very interesting. With the Palace letters, it was a bit more slow moving because I knew that there were letters written between the Governor-General and the Palace. That was standard. They'd always been described as dispatches. You know, you might expect, and they were called annual reports, so you might expect 2 or 3 a year. And in fact, with the other Governors-Generals, now that we've seen their letters, thanks to the court action and the court decision, we know that was the case. Very few letters. Kerr's letters were over the top in every way, hundreds of letters. I mean, he was just obsessed. And that's what we didn't know. I had no idea how many letters there were even after I began the court case. I thought there might be 30 or 40 at a pinch, and there are over 200 letters. So what I didn't know was that they were sitting there in Kerr's archives, and that I could find a number and a catalogue entry. And other than that, I wasn't able to get any access to them whatsoever. They wouldn't even give me a descriptor or how many there were. But then I found this other file, which said it was open, but of course, once I asked for it, the archive said, no, it's not open, which was a complete copy of all of Kerr's letters that had been, and all of the Queen's letters back to him that had been taken by Kerr had been taken by Kerr's official secretary, Sir David Smith, after Kerr left office, to post to Kerr when he was in the south of France writing his memoirs, and were later deposited in the National Archives by the Kerr family. And that did have a description of the letters. It did make it clear that they should be released. And it was actually the copy that gave us a way in to the legal action initially, even though that wasn't covered in the final decision.
And was David Fricker the head of the archives at that stage as you started seeking some of this further information, or did he come in at a later stage? So...
No, he was, by the time I really started seeking the letters, he came in about 2010, 2011. And although I'd made initial moves to get the letters earlier than that, it was only once I'd seen what else was in Kerr's papers that I was able to put together a picture of the letters, and Fricker was very much at the archives by then, because as I explored Kerr's papers, and Kerr's papers in the archives are enormous. There's well over 1,000 individual files there. And I first started looking at them. No one had opened them. No one had requested them to be open. They were almost all still closed. So I started that process of opening them, finding what was there. And to my astonishment, he had referred repeatedly to these letters. He was, not only was he proud of them, but he was convinced that if they were released, people would support his actions more fully, because they'd see that he had run all of this past the palace in the months leading up to the dismissal. So he was always keen for them to be released. He actually quoted directly from some of the letters in various things in his papers. He'd referred to, for example, Sir Martin Charteris's advice to me on dismissal. And Sir Martin Charteris is the Queen's private secretary. Clearly, Kerr was getting advice on dismissal from Sir Martin Charteris. There's just no question about that any longer. And there were actually cut and pasted extracts from some of the letters that I found in a separate file that Kerr had referred to in his book. So by the end of all of that process, I could see what the letters were likely to have inside them, because I'd seen all of this in Kerr's papers. And that was important for a legal action, because it meant we could actually argue they're not personal letters, as the archive says. They are clearly to do with matters intrinsic to the relationship between the Governor-General and the Palace, and matters relating to the functions of a Governor-General. And that was critical, because that's the basis on which we argued they are official records. They're called Commonwealth records, and therefore they should be available under the Archives Act and open as they now are. So it was only because I'd spent all that time going through Kerr's papers in the archives and piecing together bits. So that took a very long time. You know, that was probably the product of nearly a decade's work. But without that, and don't forget, two chapters of my book, The Dismissal Dossier, were also included in this material that went up to the High Court ultimately. It was only because of that that we could build really a sort of empirical base for the case. And of course, that took a wonderful legal form through the marvellous lawyers that were involved.
And that was, so yeah, as you were just saying, you went through an escalation at different levels of the judiciary to get to, and then I think was it Brett Walker came in on your assistance? Yes,
we had, and it was all pro bono. So, you know, I want to give a great thanks to the legal team, because it would just never have happened otherwise. I couldn't possibly have thought about such a case. But we had Anthony Whitlam, KC was the lead barrister, and Tom Brennan, SC, had been part of this, and a very important part of this from the outset, and instructed by Cause Chambers Westgarth. Brett Walker came in for the appeal. So the appeal, we lost at the federal court. Brett Walker came in at the federal court appeal to the full federal court, where we lost in a split decision 2-1. I have to say that was very devastating. I thought we had a very good chance there, and I didn't know for many months whether we could continue. But the lawyers were very, very clear that they believed there were grounds for appeal to the High Court. And that's a big step. I can assure you that's a very big step. So it took some time to reach the decision that, yes, it would continue. And yes, they took the case all the way up to the High Court then. And it was, you know, from my perspective, I felt so absolutely grateful, not only that they were taking the case, but to have this opportunity to see this in action, to see what had been a process of historical research become a legal action. It was absolutely fascinating. And I still am so grateful to have had the opportunity to sit through that, to hear Anthony Whitlam and Brett Walker in action in the court was a great gift, and they were absolutely marvellous. And you know, that to be in a High Court action and to see the 7 judges, it really was extraordinary. And if nothing else, you know, I felt as I was sitting there whatever the outcome, I knew it would have been judged absolutely, you know, in the most precise and tightest manner it possibly could be. So, you know, that's a very important part. That sense of open justice, I think, is absolutely critical in having faith in a legal system all the way through. And there was no question of that in this case.
So in the TV program, you know, they interviewed Malcolm Turnbull, and I think he sort of made the comment he was surprised with the 2-1 decision in the federal court. I think he'd expected you to win. I mean, was there scope for the government of the day just to say, Jenny's got to be given access, make a direction to the archives, not to keep on going through to the court process?
Oh, yeah, there were several ways that could have happened.
Yeah.
One of them was what's called taking over. The Commonwealth could have taken over the case and closed it down effectively and said, we're instructing the archives to open these. Instead, the government under Attorney General Christian Porter did engage with the case, and in fact they joined with the archives in fighting my case, and they put a joint submission, which was pretty daunting to have the Attorney General of the day join with the archives in a submission to the High Court against our case. So no, the government of the day was never going to go down that path. But as Malcolm Turnbull intimated, what he could have done, and I understand in one way his obvious reluctance to do this and his preference to let the court case take its course, was that he could have said to the Queen, well, we believe that these letters ought to be open, despite her express wishes, and they were express wishes from the Queen. It was the Queen's instruction after Kerr's death that the letters not be opened until at least 2026, and only then with the ruling monarch's permission. So it was effectively to have a permanent veto over the release of the letters. And so it would have required, as I think he said, the Prime Minister to go against the wishes of the Queen. And as he said, this was something you would prefer to avoid if at all possible. And so it was much easier to say, oh, well, Jenny's already taken the case. Let's leave her to deal with it. Thank you very much.
Sounds like a Malcolm approach. But so as I recall, there was also a diary, relevant pages went missing in an accident in the Governor General's house. I mean, so does this sort of, to you, this, I suppose you could use the word protection of what happened in 1975. Do you sort of feel that this is a continuation, protecting phrase of protecting the Governor General, protecting the royalty that, you know, we need to grow out of?
Look, I think there continues to be several problems with access to material relating to 1975 that we just need to get over. You know, it's 50 years ago next year, and yet things are missing, things have disappeared. I tend to think the things that have disappeared, of which one is the visitors' books to Government House. That's a very important, basic, fundamental original research document. In fact, very early on, several people said to me, you should look at the visitors' books to Government House, see who was visiting Kerr. Now, the Government House guest books are in the National Archives, and the catalogue entry said there was a complete set all the way through to about 1986. But of course, when I asked for them, guess what? They stop in 1974, and suddenly they're just not there. And I asked Government House. Government House says that they have no record of them. I asked the archives. The archives said they were never sent across. All the other ones were. So both these major institutions are claiming they have no idea where the Government House guest books are, or whether they even went across to the archives. I mean, this is intolerable. So they're missing. The other thing that disappeared with, you know, truly just almost unbelievable reaction was that I managed to find a reference to an ASIO vetting file on Gough Whitlam from the 1960s. It wasn't on the catalogue, it was referred to in something else I was looking at. And this is a way when you get into archival research, you know, I call it a mosaic approach, where suddenly something in another file will point you to something that isn't actually on the public record. The catalogue is just an iota of the of what is actually in the archives. Not everything is put on a public catalogue, and you've got no way of knowing what other material is held. But I found this reference. It had a catalogue number. I asked to see it, and the archive said, yes, it's there. And 5 months went by and I received nothing. And when I chased it up again, I was sent a note from ASIO which said that they had destroyed the file after having the file since the 1960s. Lo and behold, just weeks before I asked for it, it happened to be culled and destroyed. I mean, this is absurd. But nevertheless, that's what I was told. And so Gough Whitlam's security file has never seen the light of day, and according to both the archives and ASIO, never will. So, this is the sort of thing also that leads people to have all sorts of conspiracy theories that may be completely misplaced. And it's why a much more transparent and accountable attitude to archives, I think, is so important. Just put it out there, we can deal with whatever it tells us. I mean, yes, we know now that the palace was deeply involved in Kerr's decision to dismiss the government, and no, the monarchy hasn't collapsed, although I think there's far more questioning of it than there was previously, and a lot more distaste for that involvement, which they've always denied and continue to deny. So, but nevertheless, even though the monarchy put a submission in to the case saying that to open these letters would endanger the monarchy in Australia, of course, that hasn't happened in any real sense. So I think the concerns are overblown, and we need to restate a priority for knowledge of our own history.
So Felicity's asked, do you think the CIA was involved in any during the dismissal? I mean, that's
look, that's a very common question, Alex, and it's an imponderable in the sense that, having spent so long looking at this material, I never rule anything in or out, because you never know what you don't know. So I've always tried to follow material that I have. I think, given the extent of the misrepresentation and false claims about a whole range of things to do with the final months of the Whitlam government, that it's really important to get the history right as far as we know. And so I haven't gone into areas that are just pure speculation at this stage. And as I said, that doesn't mean I'm necessarily ruling anything in or out. It just says it's safer for me, and I think better for our history, to follow what we now know and what we know at this stage, and to make our assessments based on that. One of the big questions was always, was the palace involved? I think we now know they clearly were. And the next, there is a question over the Americans' involvement, and I think enough material to say categorically that they were extremely concerned in the last months of the Whitlam government, particularly over Pine Gap and whether the Pine Gap lease would be renewed. I don't think Whitlam was ever going to not renew it, but that's not the point. They were deeply concerned that come, I think it was 15th of December when the lease ran out, that may not be renewed. And the second thing is that Whitlam was due to announce in the Parliament on the afternoon of the 11th of November the names of CIA personnel who were working at Pine Gap, which had been denied to him by Foreign Affairs, but whose names he ought to, as Prime Minister, have been given. They were apoplectic about that prospect. So no doubt there were huge concerns about security coinciding with this time. And I think that's undoubtedly one of the many, many pressures that Kerr was feeling on that at that time.
So Jenny, maybe a double bunger question. I mean, and you're a member of the Republican movement, as is Malcolm Turnbull. And do you feel, in some respect, what you've come out is quite a damning indictment of actions, but it was 50 years ago, that it hasn't, been earth-shattering, if I can put it that way. To those who are interested in politics and to those of an age, it's interesting, but it sort of hasn't led people to say, well, we've automatically got to get rid of the monarchy. And then, John Kerr, I know he wrote his autobiography. I can't think, has there been a sort of definitive biography of Kerr, or is he sort of seen as a bit of a buffoon? And there's more interesting figures to look at in that period. So a double bunger.
Well, the dismissal didn't lead to a massive increase in support for a republic. I mean, in some sectors it did. There was, as you know, the polarisation was really immense and in many ways difficult for people who were not there at the time, I think, to appreciate just how deeply distressed it was for people to lose a government that they had waited 23 years to finally elect. And for it to be removed in that way was, really quite shocking.
So Jenny, but also partly now that with your book having come out on the palace letters.
Yeah, look, I think in a funny way, I think that actually has had a greater impact on republicanism. I mean, I think it's one of several things, including, of course, the death of the Queen, that has built a sense of, well, why do we really need a republic or a foreign head of state here? Why is the monarch chosen by dynastic birthright our head of state? They've never even been here as monarch. So I think, and many people have written to me saying, look, having read your book and I'm a confirmed Republican. So I think the knowledge of what was happening in 75 is just part of several elements that are pushing more solidly towards a republic. I think we're a long way from that. Unfortunately, I am a committed Republican. I just think not in the American sense, but any notion of an independent, proud nation, an autonomous nation, would surely support being able to control and manage all aspects of its governance, including its own head of state. And really, that's what we're talking about, is the capacity to have our own head of state determined in some way by us. The great stumbling block, of course, is the Constitution and the need to have a referendum. And I think because of the lack of success with the voice referendum, I think, unfortunately, there will not be strong moves to go to another referendum on the Republic. Personally, I think we should get used to referenda. They're in our Constitution. They're a means of changing the Constitution. Whitlam had, I think, 4 referenda at one of the 1974 double dissolution election. None of them succeeded. But he said, well, I'm still going to put them forward, both as an educative exercise and so that people become familiar with the process of changing the Constitution. We shouldn't be so fearful of that. But I think you're right that has now become something that's been pushed off very much because of the outcome of the voice, which I think is a great pity.
And then coming back to John Kerr, and correct me, did he not write about possibly dismissing Fraser a year after he took power? That was mentioned, but no, that comment I made about no definitive biography and is he perceived as a buffoon, and as Evan has made the comment, his performance at the Melbourne Cup in 1977 sort of seen as a shining light. But anyway.
Oh, well, he did write his memoirs.
No, yeah.
Yes, and we now know Kerr had that the palace requested an advance copy of that, in effect, to vet his memoirs. So his memoirs were checked over by the palace. To me, this is astonishing, and another reason why we should, sever these colonial relics, as Gough called them, sooner rather than later. What role has the palace got with our own history? Not only involved in advising Kerr regarding the possible dismissal of the government, then denying they did so, and then making sure that Kerr omits, this is the wording from the palace, to omit any reference to his discussions with Sir Martin Charteris about the controversy, which of course is a reference to the palace letters and the secret discussions they were having at the time. Well, Kerr duly made sure that there's no mention of them. And if you look in his book, the only mention is half a sentence saying that he was keeping the palace informed. That's it. And the palace writes back and says how delighted they are that he has done so. So this is really disturbing, that the palace reaches into a work that purports to be a work of history, as Kerr always said, that he was putting down the facts of the matter. Well, no, he wasn't. He was putting them down as the palace was prepared to let them be put down. But yes, he, I think, is very much a tarnished figure, to say the least. And to be perfectly frank, as Malcolm Turnbull said in the film, The Search for the Palace Letters, he said, well, Kerr was sozzled all the time. And I'm afraid that's true. The Melbourne Cup debacle in which he can barely stand up, let alone hand the cup to the winning team, was not the first time he'd had this sort of public disgrace. And the year before, he'd fallen over at the Tamworth show while he was trying to put the ribbon and the medal over the award-winning bull. And, you know, it's a terribly sad story because he fell over, he missed the bull, he's flat in the mud, and there happened to be a local photographer there who took that exact shot of Lady Kerr trying to lift the hoof of the cow off Sir John Kerr prone in the mud, and it won a Walkley Award for the best photograph of the year. But it's a tragic statement of how Kerr became consumed by what he'd done, desperately trying to validate what he'd done and to have approbation for what he'd done from people in positions of power. And looking through his records, as I have for so long, is actually a very, it's quite a draining experience, because you can see a really disturbed man there who basically destroyed himself by what he'd done, and he knew that. And it's a very, I think he was manipulated relentlessly by others, particularly Fraser, who's managed to sort of step away from this breach very successfully. But he was a very, very weak man, Sir John Kerr.
I think it's quite sad. He's lucky social media wasn't around, or we'd have all the Barnaby type photos of him from the town.
Oh yes, yeah, that's right. Because it actually is very difficult to get a copy of that Walkley Award-winning photo. I put it, I think, in one or other of my books, and it was very hard to get an original. I think we had to go in the end off a rather grainy newspaper coverage. So certainly if you'd had social media at the time, a lot more would have been known about Kerr's proclivities.
I'm just trying to remember who was it who told Whitlam not to appoint Kerr. He's not the friend that you think he is. Was it Kep Henderson?
Well, most likely Lionel Murphy. In fact, Murphy, I report, was horrified. Several people told me that when he found out, Murphy was utterly horrified and said, "You will rue the day you ever appointed John Kerr Governor General." Well, yes, he did, because Murphy knew of Kerr's background, and Kerr's because they'd appeared on opposite sides of many of the industrial law cases in the 50s. Murphy always appeared for left-wing unions, sometimes members of the Communist Party. He wasn't going to say no to cases that came to him. Kerr, on the other hand, often appeared with Jim McClellan for what was seen as the grouper unions, the DLP offshoot, extreme right wing of both the Labor Party and the union movement in New South Wales in particular. And so Murphy knew exactly where Kerr's allegiances lie, and they did not lie with the Labor Party at that time, and they hadn't since the time of the split in the 1950s. In fact, Kerr had been approached to lead the DLP on the day that it was formed. He was at that meeting, and he declined that and didn't want to be publicly involved. But he made it perfectly clear in several of his writings that his allegiances ceased, if he ever had them, with the Labor Party, and that he certainly supported the extreme, the grouper faction, if any, in terms of his legal work at the time. So Murphy was very aware of that. Murphy did not know, and in fact, Whitlam, being a stickler for protocol, didn't tell anybody until he appointed Kerr, which was a great mistake, because there were many who would have advised him not to.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So I want to come back and ask a couple of questions about David Fricker, who was the CEO of the archives whilst you're there. And Evans asked a good question, if you want to comment on how Fricker came from an intelligence background, and how you think that might have affected the debacle over the letters, and what's happened to the release procedure since because of his bad influence. So that's quite a question. And the one I wanted to also ask about Fricker is, because you dealt with him for so many years, and there's quite a lot of bad grace when they lost the Supreme Court. I mean, did you have a grudge? Did you have a grudge against him? I mean, if I was in your situation, I'd be waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning thinking, what can I do to this man? Do I put a bomb under his car? I'd take it very personal.
No, well, look, you can't focus on those sort of things, because you never get anything done. You've got to work with what you've got. I won't say I wasn't upset at times. The thing that upset me more than any of the other things, you know, because the court case was going to run its course and we just had to wait for that. But what really, and you probably gathered this from watching the film, which I let everybody know is still available on ABC iView if you look for the search for the Palace Letters. It's had great reviews, and it is a very, very, I think, entertaining detective story style uncovering of the letters.
It's a great film.
What was I going to say? Oh, yes. I was going to say that it's clear from that, I think, much more than I thought at the time, but the filmmaker has carried my sense of this very clearly, was my dismay at his releasing the letters at an event at which I was not even informed and not invited. That was shocking. I'd spent, you know, the best part of 10 years trying to get the letters, 4.5 years in a legal action. I had a meeting with Fricker suggesting to him that we do a joint presentation of the letters when they're open, that we go through them together, we have a question and answer, etc. He declined that and said he would be in touch. I never heard another word until a journalist rang me and said, "What do you feel about the letters being released on Tuesday?" And I said, "What do you mean?" So journalists have been alerted to the fact that the letters were about to be released. It was in the middle of COVID. If I'd had any lead in, I could have and would have arranged to be there, but I wasn't invited. You know, it was extraordinary, and that was disgraceful. To say that, you know, that was utterly disgraceful, but it was all quite deliberate because it enabled Fricker then to set a narrative, which I have to say was a false narrative, about the palace not being involved. I mean, that was no historian, and there was no historian there, but no historian, had they been there, would have ever stood for that assessment. It was just outrageous. So he looked at 9 letters out of over 200 and decided to spin a narrative around that. It was an appalling day, and I think that's the blackest mark, frankly, on Fricker.
So was that, you know, his personal, or do you think he was getting orders from above?
I know that was him, and I know that because I put in an FOI request for. It may well have been the result of discussions with others, I don't know, but I put in an FOI request to see emails that were exchanged between the Attorney General's department and Fricker, and at one point the AGs had written to him a couple of days before this and said they felt uneasy about the fact that I was not there and that I was not scheduled to be there, and that surely this should happen with me. And Fricker said, no, it's fine, it's all been arranged. So he was warned by Attorney Generals about this failure to engage with me on it, and he took that on himself. So unless something else emerges that shows he also was speaking to others, but that was straight from the minister's office. So as far as I can see, and certainly publicly, there's been no indication otherwise than that this was Fricker's decision.
And so the other question Evan asked around his intelligence background, and do you think that had any influence in the way he handled it? For those who don't know, he was a senior. Yeah. Yes,
he was this 2IC at ASIO for many years, and his particular area was in information management. Look, I think it does affect everything, because there's a totally different fundamental rationale for archival work from security work. Security work is focused entirely on dealing with materials that may or may not be factual. They may be rumours from people. They may be picking up intelligence as opposed to information. There is a difference there. Hard information versus what's seen as soft intelligence that would have to be taken further to be ascertained. And there's certainly a privileging of closure in the security services, which is quite antithetical to the fundamental values and functions of the archives, which is to make available for public access our own historical records. I frankly am horrified that somebody from a security background about information management could in any way be seen as appropriate for a body like the National Archives, that the core part, apart from collection and maintaining of material, is to ensure public access and to facilitate public access to to Australians about our history. So I think it coloured everything, and I think that's a great pity.
Okay, question from Wall. How do you see the current political judicial system in the United States compared to the Australian courts?
Oh, well, that's something for someone far more versed in
Okay.
or to talk about. But look, what I would say is I think it is a very good thing here that we do not have a process of dragging potential High Court judges through the parliamentary process for questioning. I mean, I think that process alone in the US really undermines the respect for the judiciary, because so many claims and counterclaims are made against them. It completely politicises decision-making very overtly. I think we have a good system here. It's not perfect, because there's no perfect system that's been devised in the world, but I think it's a really good one. You know, you get governments appointing judges when and if they can, and hopefully you get a mix of judges that, I mean, I can only say from my own experience of having that great benefit of watching judges with my own case, is how respectful it was, how much work they had done, their knowledge of the most minute area of one of the obscure documents we might have collected was just extraordinary, and therefore how much faith it brings in a decision they make.
Yeah, I think their intellect is outside my pay rate. And yeah, I had the privilege of once giving Michael Kirby a lift for a Writers' Festival event. And yeah, no, it was amazing just his breadth. But Jenny, how much dealings did you have with Gough Whitlam? You've written several books on Gough Whitlam. Sort of over the years, how much did you have to do with Gough? You mentioned you told him about his grandfather.
Yeah, well, I had quite a lot. I was very lucky. I had a lot to do with him because I began the book. Firstly, I'd interviewed him when I did the book on Murphy. And a few people said to me after that, you should do a biography now of Gough Whitlam. But I didn't want to go back into this, what was really a similar time frame, a similar time period, and a similar political sort of sphere at that time. I needed a bit of a break. And I did the Hardy book over the next 5 or 6 years, and then approached Whitlam about the biography. And he was very supportive. I simply said that I wanted to interview him. I made it very clear that I did not see it in any way as an authorised biography. I couldn't work like that. It was my biography. He wasn't going to see it. And to his credit, he never asked to see it. So I tried to treat him, you know, as I would any other interviewee. I interviewed him. We had several very long interviews early on, and because of that support that he gave me, I was able to speak to all of the family, Margaret Whitlam, all of the Whitlam children, Graham Freudenberg, people who worked in his office, Carol Summerhayes, who was a steadfast member of his office staff, and others. So many interviews as well. And because the book ended up unexpectedly as 2 volumes and went over a 10-year period, I saw him basically whenever I was in Sydney. I'd call in and see him. I might have some questions for him. We might just have a chat about whatever he was interested in at the time. But the formal interviews were early on, because later on he was not really well enough to do those lengthy interviews. But he sent me many letters with clippings from newspapers and other things. And that was a wonderful way of getting him to tell me what was important to him about particular events. And that's an important part of a biography, understanding what your subject is, what they saw as important, not just what you see as important. And so I did have, I think, a very fruitful relationship. But it was interesting, you know, he's such a, could be seen as a very, not dominating, but awesome presence.
Mm.
And yet he, I think he was very careful not to appear that way, because I was the biographer. So, you know, there was never any question. Neither of us ever raised this question about whether he would see the book. And I think he just knew that that wasn't something I was going to do. I'd already written 2 biographies, and I knew that was not something for me, not something I could have done. It would have been too compromising. And he later told me, the only thing he later told me after he read the first volume, and he really wasn't well enough to comment on the second, was he said, "Oh, I think you put too much emphasis on the religious background," which I thought was very interesting, because he's always wanted to step away from his religious background, even though, you know, once you know the family background, it's very clear that even though the organised religion was not a part of his life later, I think the ethical core of it was. And you can't avoid that when you've grown up in a family that is tithing its income, for example. And he said he was thrown out of Sunday school at the age of 11, when he questioned whether it was really possible to make the whole world in just 7 days.
I met him when I was 9. My dad was in the army and we were at Townsville, and they'd just opened up new accommodation for officers, and that was sort of a bit of a first for the army. And he was the opposition leader, and he came and visited. It was 68. He came and visited them. So my brother and I ran down and got his autograph. That night he went to the officers' mess and had a drink with the officers, and he met my father, and he said, "Oh yes, I met Alex and David earlier today," which, you know, phenomenal to remember. Phenomenal to remember, but I certainly can remember it was an awesome presence. So Jenny, maybe just a couple of personal questions just to finish up. You know, who's been the biggest influence in your life, if you look back?
Oh, I think my parents, but perhaps my parents in different ways. My mother, because of her very strong, determined outlook, and, you know, that political legal edge, I think, owes very much to her. And my father, because he had a great love of words. He loved writing, and I think he was a bit of a writer monkey, that, you know, we were always saying to him, "You should write down your stories." He always had funny stories about patients. He said, "Oh, I can't write them down, I'd be sued." But, you know, he had a great way with words, and he'd use words that I realize now most people don't use. And so I feel like I had a love of looking up words in the dictionary, because if I didn't understand words, he'd just say, "Look it up," and he'd give me the dictionary. So I think that was a great combination in terms of family. But as I said, a couple of writers have had a big influence. One was the Bertrand Gross book I mentioned earlier, The Friendly Face of Fascism. And the other is a marvellous biography. Well, I should say a marvellous biographer, Annie Cohen-Salal. She's just had a book fairly recently out on Picasso, which by all accounts is magnificent. And the book I read that really moved me to write in terms of the style of writing biography was a book on Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre. And the reason being that even though it's a biography through a philosophical tradition, it is totally situated within the political and social framework, not just of France, but of Europe at the time. So it's a fascinating use of biography to tell history, and that form of narrative history and narrative biography I'm very, very interested in. So in terms of writerly style, they were great. That was a great model or influence. But funnily enough, the detective story writers, because I like to create a sense of drama, intrigue, you know, political sort of thriller. I like Agatha Christie and Arthur Conan Doyle, these writers who enable you to, you know, want to turn the page and you want to keep going. And I think, you know, that's a really important part of successful writing. You want your author to come with you, even if you're on a rather turgid political tale. You want them with you all the way to the end.
Yep. There's a great Irish writer, John Boyne, who he's been writing. He's gay, and he's writing a lot about the church and religion in Ireland now. He wrote The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which is what he's famous for, but he's so much more. I'd recommend. I'm sort of everybody I recommend him to. There's a few people on here who know I've lent his books to. So anyway, so Jenny, just to finish up, where to in the future, and how do you relax? What's your favourite spot in the world? I've never asked.
Well, I'm pretty happy. I'm pretty happy here in Sydney, relaxing. It's unusual for me to come here and not be working. So, 5 days off has been marvellous. Except, today's a little bit of work, but I don't count this as work. This is a friendly chat. But I like going to Byron Bay because we used to go there when I was very young as kids with my parents, and my sister lives up there. So that's a favourite place. And like everybody, I like to go to France if I possibly can, but that's not somewhere I've been for about 5 years, but hopefully soon. So to relax, I just read and walk and go and have coffee somewhere, and that'll do me. Sorry?
Into the future?
Oh, yes, you asked about the future. Well, funnily enough, I am preparing a book, and it's a book about the dismissal. And the reason is that next year is the 50th anniversary. And even though it may appear that I've written a lot about the dismissal, I actually haven't. I've written a lot about bits about the dismissal, like the palace letters or the parts that came out in my biography of Whitlam, which is now more than a decade old. And I think because of what's come out of the archives since then, in a decade since, I want to write what you might see as a definitive book in terms of what actually happened, what do we know was happening at the time. And that would include a much closer look at what Fraser and the coalition was doing at the time. I think that tends to get forgotten in the focus on either the palace or the CIA or Kerr, and to bring it back to a narrative in which the government was very much under siege almost from the moment it was elected, particularly through the Senate. So to get a sense of a sort of trajectory of a government that was trying to do things, but that was obstructed and finally was dismissed, and to look back at that 50 years later.
That sounds fantastic. And you're going to include Norman Gunston. I think it says a good thing about Australia that Norman Gunston could appear on the steps of Parliament.
It was certainly a very, very Australian moment.
Yeah. So look, I'd just like to say thanks very much. Thanks for interrupting your break in Sydney. When you made that comment about being in Sydney, it sort of reminds me of what Paul Keating said, if you're not in Sydney, you're slumming it, or words to that effect. It's been great. And I'm also going to approach Jenny's partner, Daryl DeLorca, if I pronounce that correctly, who was the producer of the film and has produced a lot of films, and probably will be a focus around how hard it is to get independent films up and running in Australia. And I don't know if you've had much to do with Andrew Pike, who's in Canberra, who's also...
Oh, yes, I think Darren knows him well, yeah.
Yeah, they would. The great guy, yeah. And yeah, so Andrew's had some of those issues as well. But look, it's just been fascinating. There's so much you've covered. Go on. And the fact that we've still got 32 participants, so 75% of the participants stayed on after 11 o'clock. It's a tribute to it. So Jenny, as I said to you yesterday, this is one of the pedigree interviews I've done, and I'm really delighted that you've been so generous of your time. It's been fascinating, and all the best for the rest of the time in Sydney.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Alex. And yes, buy the books, watch the film, and look forward to the book on the dismissal next year.
And Jenny,
maybe we'll talk again.
And Jenny, I'll just go, yeah, I'd be love to talk to you again. There's a couple of forums we do, but I was just going to say also, just as a token of thanks, we make a donation to the Callum Lodge, which is based at Woden and the John Hunter Hospital. And it works with young children, 5 to 17 with mental health issues, and it introduces them to books and music as a form of therapy.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, so we make a donation on... You've probably got plenty of bottles of wine. The last thing you need is another bottle of wine. And we make that donation on your behalf as a token of our appreciation.
Oh, thank you. That's a great thing to do. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Alex. And thanks, everyone. And enjoy your day. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, then. Thanks, Jenny.